All right, so we're going to continue in our series as we've been looking at hostage. And last week it was bilingual, and we went over the topic of fear. And we talked a little bit about how fear is going to be the thing that actually can be found in many of the roots of each of these in the next parts of the series. Is that fear kind of goes underneath all of them. There's a lot of fear and a lot of worry and a lot of things that be able to get trapped in there. So what does it mean to be a hostage? A hostage says someone has taken prisoner, right, by an enemy to force to do what the enemy wants, right? So that's what a hostage is. So when we're looking at these topics, we go back to it and say, what did fear want you to be able to do in response to the fear that has risen up in you? You see, there's lots of responses to that. Fear generates that, and it says, I'm going to lash out. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. And you do, and you take everything, and you turn everything into the enemy. Bitterness is what we're going to be dealing with today. And the bitterness response is usually a build-up as well. Because there's underneath that bitterness. Bitterness is kind of like saying, I'm going to construct this wall to make sure that nobody is able to penetrate. Right? And so you build these walls and you put the structure up, and you find yourself that you're actually the one that has built up a box around you, and you're the only one inside. You're not dealing with the issues. You're saying, I'm going to trap myself, and this is going to be the best way possible for me to be able to conceal myself from the rest of the world. But you see, bitterness demands a lot from you. Bitterness is going to keep you in a place that it's going to continue when you're looking at people, when you're looking at situations, when you're looking at circumstances around you. Bitterness is going to keep demanding that you have a stance against these people that are not good. Bitterness is going to demand that your heart is continue to be hardened. Bitterness is going to say, you can't love those people. Bitterness has a lot. There's a lot that's built up. So we're going to look at our first passage. We've got two for today. This section, Hebrews 12, and then we're going to jump over to Ephesians. And so those are the only two places. But Hebrews chapter 12, verse 14. The writer says this, work at living at peace with everyone, right? So here's the good goal, right? It says, work at living at peace with everybody. And you're like, oh, well, that seems like it should be easy. It only has to do with me. As far as it goes with you, try to live at peace with everybody. Now, this doesn't mean that you don't confront. It doesn't mean that you don't hold accountable. It doesn't mean that you just, let's just move over all the tough stuff and just get to the easy stuff, because that's where living at peace is easy, right? But as far as it goes with you, you're trying to be able to work at peace with others. And work at living a holy life, for those who are not holy will not see the Lord. Verse 15, look after each other, so that none of you fails to receive the grace of God. Watch out that no poisonous root of bitterness grows up to trouble you, corrupting many. It's an important part of the section here of Hebrews, because bitterness has a dangerous root. That means it starts growing in us oftentimes before we even recognize it. Bitterness, it exists. It's like beneath the soil, and we're like, I'm not bitter, I'm not bitter, I'm not bitter. And yet the root is continuing to grow. We often don't see it because it's underneath the surface. Unless we're starting to dig into our emotions, our feelings, our story, then we don't recognize the root of bitterness that's actually growing underneath the soil. But really, the reason why it continues to grow is because there are things that we have not dealt with properly. When you think about it like this, it goes a little bit like this. You get a friend, right? And the friend is there, and a friend is trying to be able to be with you, to be present in your life. And then like when you're looking at these circumstances, and then all of a sudden they betray you. They say something against you. And you're like, oh, well, that doesn't feel good. And you just try to say, well, whatever. This happens. Move on. You see, you're not dealing with the issue. We're not dealing with the hurt. We're trying to be able to say the hurt isn't there. I'm just going to move past the hurt. I'm going to move past this and just be able to get to the thing, right, of just living life. But you see, again and again, we think those things are gone because we're just like, well, I've moved past it. And yet, as the scriptures tell us, you can't heal a hurt by saying it's not there. And so when we go with these undealt with issues and hurts and betrayals throughout our life, we start to be able to see like, okay, maybe I haven't moved past it because guess what? That root of bitterness has been growing. It's been growing for so long under the surface that it's starting to hit in places that I can see. We have to recognize that in our lives, we're going to have wounded hearts. What are we going to do with the wounded heart? It's really easy to just absorb it and say, everything's going to be fine. I'll just move on. I'll just absorb it. I'll take the emotion, and what I'll do is this. And this I'm a professional at. You can ask my wife about it. I take the emotions and I just push it down, right? I just push it down and I push it down and I push it down and I just say, like it should be endless is what I think, right? I just keep it down. I keep it down. If I'm just completely normal on everything, then guess what? Then I've beat it. I beat the emotion. I beat the feeling. Because we think that it's gone, we just keep pushing it down and we keep pushing it down and we act like it's not there. Where does your hurt go to? Where does your feeling of betrayal go to, right? Because it doesn't just disappear. We think it does. We act like it does. But that root of bitterness continues to try to choke us out. And that dangerous root that the writer of Hebrews is trying to be able to, he says, watch out for it. And it's in connection with living with one another. Living in relationship and trying to be at peace with people is a hard job. It's not easy. Because when we're walking along life, because we are imperfect, because we are fallen people, it's going to be really hard dealing with others who are going to hurt us and betray us. It's going to be hard. But in this, we have to say, okay, but now we have something here that he says, watch out, because there's a dangerous bitter root that is growing underneath the surface of your life and in your relationships. Don't ignore it. Don't act like it's not there. We need to be able to recognize it. see it for what it is, and be able to say, okay, now I see it, now I can understand it, now I can try to confront it, look at bitterness in the face and say, I see you, root. What do we have to do with this root? How are we going to be able to do anything if we don't deal with the root? But here's the second part of that. Is not only does that root grow, but it says that it produces a poisonous fruit. So you know roots are there for a reason. It's there for the foundation. And what the roots are bringing in is the nutrients. What it's fed is going to say this is what it's going to produce. And so what are the things that we are feeding our bitter roots with? And if we're feeding it with more bitterness and more hurt and more anger and more whatever, all these kind of negative pieces, if we're feeding, guess what's going to come out? Those same emotions. Because as he says, this poisonous fruit that is coming from the bitter root is actually going to corrupt many. Why does it corrupt many? Because bitterness is another one of those things that's just contagious. Bitterness is going to spread into your individual relationships that you're going to have with people because you have not dealt with the issues. You haven't dealt with them properly, and so therefore it's going to be something that spreads around. You know what this looks like. When all of a sudden there might be relationships at work that you're like there's kind of sour, it's kind of bitter. And then when somebody steps into the room, all of a sudden there's like this thing, it's a heaviness. Everybody feels it. Everybody's like, oh, like something's wrong with our culture. They talk about this, and it's really the fruit of bitterness. Because it may not be one with another, but somebody may be bringing in bitterness, and guess what? The poisonous fruit that's on that tree is all of a sudden flying everywhere, and people are eating up this bitterness fruit. This isn't good. Because when you actually look at this passage again, I mean, this is an important part for us not to miss in verse 15. Look after each other so that none of you fails to receive the grace of God. You see, the poisonous fruit is not just poisoning the relationships that we have, but it's actually saying it's causing people to miss the grace of God. And so when he talks about the corrupting of many, it's actually saying that this poisonous fruit that's being dropped and people are eating it and consuming it, and they themselves become bitter, and they themselves become angry, and they themselves are saying, I don't want to have any place with anybody else, and so they start building the walls around them, and they start putting it up. And bitterness only spreads. So here's the 5 characteristics of bitter people. And if you might be feeling bitter today, you might recognize yourself here. First one is this. The characteristic of a bitter person is that they justify their bitterness. So this one's really easy to do because I think we do a lot of justification of our own, right? Like, we do a lot of justification of our own sin. We do a lot of justification when we've actually hurt somebody. And we know we've hurt somebody. And then we're trying to move into this but, except. Right? We use these words to be able to justify our actions. Well, I did this because of. Right? I've had a bad life. My parents didn't treat me right. And so therefore, I can react this way for other people. You see, when we look at the circumstances in life, and when we've talked about the circumstances in life a lot, right? We say there's hard stuff that happens. What are we going to do with it? How are we going to deal with it? What are we going to do to sort through it? If we're not dealing with it properly, it's going to become a dangerous root of bitterness. Because when we see the hard things in life and you're saying, well, I've had a hard life and so therefore I can justify my actions towards people. This isn't good. It's not good to be able to justify our actions that we are trying to take out on somebody else because we haven't dealt with our own bitterness. We haven't dealt with our story in our life. So that's the first one. They justify their bitterness. The second one, they tend to become overly critical. You see, the overly critical part is this. They become overly critical not just of other people, but that's the first one. Other people, like you become critical. You're like, hey, if you just did this, I have the best way to do all things. Let me tell you how to do all things. I know best what it is to be able to live life, and so if you just live life like me, then everything would go well for you, but you're not going to follow it. Right? So when you're looking at this, you become critical of others in how they live, in how they're trying to be able to carry out life, and then when you're looking at this, you become critical. But here's the thing, you also turn that critic in on yourself. You don't try to be able to tell about this to anybody else, but because you become critical of even you, because the bitterness is there, it's already that poisonous fruit, you're eating it as well. You're trying to say, oh, give me some of that. And so then you eat it, and you become critical of others, and you become critical of own life. The third one, you secretly celebrate the misfortunes of others. So when you're looking at, then this one kind of flows out of number 2, is because when you're already critical of people, then you're already saying, hey, if you only would have done what I've done and act like I act, and then therefore you didn't, so now you get what you get. Look at you, we get to celebrate the misfortune of you. This is usually done in secret, but sometimes also finds its way into gossip, where you start to be able to drop the bitterness, poisonous fruit in front of people and say, hey, did you hear about fill in the blank? Yeah, they're getting what they deserve. The fourth one, they tend to write off entire groups of people. You see, when the bitterness happens and you start to be able to look at everybody else, the bitterness in relationships start extending to entire groups of people. We see this happen with the people that sometimes have left the church because of maybe church hurt that's happened, and they leave the church, and then they become a bitter critic against everything that is church. Well, the church only has self-righteous people. The church only has hypocrites. Well, the church only has, right? And they write off the entire thing. Why? Because they had a hurt and they didn't deal with it properly. And so when they've walked away and then they're like, look at all these people, right? But this happens in all kinds of different areas. When we start to be able to write off entire groups of people because we are bitter. And then the last one is this: they struggle to see the bitterness that's in the mirror. Nobody likes to be able to be shown that they've got a poisonous root that's growing up in them, and that the fruit is falling all around them. and it's causing bitterness to be felt in relationships around them. You see, God likes to be able to show us the mirror sometimes. God likes to be able to say, have you seen this? Reflection. You see, the mirror is not for me to be able to tell you you're bitter, or for you to tell me I'm bitter. But God's going to show us in times and in places that, God, we've had some of these bitter roots in our lives, and we've seen the bitter fruit that we are putting in front of people, but I don't really want to see it. I'm going to justify it. And when it's shown to me, just as God says right here in this, and we'll get to our next passage that also talks about bitterness, but in this passage it's saying it's causing hurt amongst you. This is a big deal. Because the bitterness that exists are causing relationships to crack. They're causing relationships to crumble. So we need to be able to see our part. Because you can't deal with somebody else's bitterness. You have to deal with yours. I can't make sure that everyone lives at peace. Do you notice that's what the passage, it did not say, make sure that you're making sure that everybody else is living at peace. No, it says as far as it goes with you, live at peace. You can only deal with your stuff. You can't make people deal with their stuff. You can only say, you know what, I've seen a bitter root that has been welling up inside of me, and I need to be able to do something about it. We can, in relationship, start talking to people about roots of bitterness. Saying we need to be able to deal with the root that's happening right here and now, because if we don't, poisonous is everywhere. So that's the question. With whom or what are you bitter about? Not saying everybody has to have bitterness. Not saying that everybody is bitter. But what I am saying is that there's a moment that God is trying to be able to call us to attention to say, where am I bitter with? Whom am I bitter at? Because this draws the attention back to it and says, guess what? I'm going to acknowledge it. I'm going to stare at it in the face and I'm going to say, what's the hurt that I haven't dealt with? What's the people and the hurt and the betrayal that maybe has occurred that I need to be able to get to the root of it to understand it? We have to be able to see it. We have to acknowledge it. We have to say it's there, because if we don't, we're just ignoring it and pushing it down. So how do we kill the root? There's entire industries of poisons that you can be able to use to be able to kill the roots of all kinds of weeds. So is it good for us to be able to take poison to be able to kill the roots? No, it's not good for us. It's going to actually poison the ground. And so when we're looking at poisoning the ground, we're like, no, we have to get back to something that is going to be good, right, and salutary for us, so that we can say, God, teach me how to be able to get to the root. And here's the killer. It's forgiveness. So let's see what Paul says about it. If you got your Bibles, feel free to open it up. This is the only other passage we'll be at today. So Ephesians chapter 4, this is towards the end, the last two verses of chapter 4, which is 31 and 32. This is what Paul says: get rid of all bitterness, rage, anger, harsh words, and slander, as well as all types of evil behavior. Instead, be kind to each other, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, just as God through Christ has forgiven you. So when we start to be able to see what's happening, because the same thing in verse 31 that we saw in Hebrews, it's the same thing. There's bitterness, there's rage, there's anger, there's harsh words, and all of this is coming from the bitter root. It's driving up in us. These are the emotions that we are feeling. These are the things that are being expressed outwardly to others as well. So what do we do? He says, instead of trying to be able to display those things, he said we have to get to the root and kill it, which is through forgiveness. Now, this is the hard part. Because when we look at the hurt that's been leveled against us, and maybe it was from the closest relationships that we have in our lives, when the hurt is done to us, we say, I just can't forgive. Let me give you an example of this. I remember in my vicarage congregation in Freeport, Illinois, and I was talking about forgiveness in a message one day, and so then I came to a conversation after the message was preached, and there was a gentleman, and he talked to me about this forgiveness level, and he said this. He's like, well, there's some stuff that you just can't forgive. And I said, speak more. He's like, well, I was at war. And I was in the Vietnam War. And there were people on the other side who murdered my friends. And I saw them die right before me. He said, I'm never going to look at that enemy and say, I forgive you. And I'm like, so here's the thing. I said, you've been carrying this with you for generations. You've been holding down inside of you this rage, this anger toward an entire people group. And you don't think God has said something about this? Because the way that we forgive is going to have to go back to Christ on this, right? It has to go back to this, because here's the part. The deep hurt that I know that many of you have had in your lives from the people that are close to you, people that have betrayed you, people that have hurt you deeply, right? And we were just saying, so what am I going to do? Just write it off? No. Forgiveness is not writing things off. It's not you saying, it's fine. That is not forgiveness. Don't hear that as forgiveness. That, when you say, it's fine, you're saying, what you did to me was okay. It wasn't okay. The hurt and betrayal is not okay. Forgiveness is being able to look at and say, it's trying to hold me hostage. It's trying to be able to look at all of that pain and say, what's the pain now it's going to hurt? It's going to continue to hurt me. Forgiveness rarely has to do with another person. The other person in that relationship, that's reconciliation, not forgiveness. The two are different. Forgiveness says, I'm no longer going to allow this pain, this hurt, this anger, this rage to be able to fill in me because of them. I'm going to forgive, and that forgiveness says, this is gone. And why do we have to look back at Christ for this? Because here's the thing, all of the sin that we have built up in our entire lives is also not just a sin sometimes of other people, but it's also all of it is a sin against God. And then when we look at the offense that we have created against God, and yet God says this, I sent Jesus to be in your place, to die in your place, to forgive you. There's no level of hurt that God doesn't know, that God hasn't felt from the things that we've leveled on God. And so when we look to Christ, as Paul tells us, he says this in 32, be kind to each other, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, just as God through Christ has forgiven you. How did Christ forgive you? Was it partially? Was it conditionally? Was it, hey, you know what? Like, if you make the first step in, then I'll consider forgiveness. Or you need to go and like torture yourself, and then you can come back to me, and then I'll consider forgiveness. Is this what God does when God is trying to be able to call sinners to Himself? Do you think that God Himself is saying there's strings attached to this forgiveness? No. And so the same thing when we are looking at this and we're saying, how do I forgive? I have to forgive fully. This is the only thing that's going to cut the root where it stands. We forgive as Christ is forgiven. And so we have a choice. God gives us a choice. What are you going to do? You going to keep drinking the poison and expecting the other person to die? You expecting to be able to say, no, I'm going to continue to harbor this anger, this resentment, these fears. I'm going to keep it. I'm going to absorb it. And you think it's going to make you stronger? Or are you going to say, God, I need help? I'm holding bitterness and anger and rage against people. Can you help me deal with the root? Can you help me deal with forgiveness? Because it's the only way to kill the root. So here's the thing today. You know, these series of messages are going to probably sound a little somber as well because we are in the season of Lent. But I don't want you to miss the good news. I don't want you to miss the reason why we don't just talk about bitterness because we're trying to be able to just pull it out, but we're trying to deal with bitterness because we want to kill the roots that are in our lives. We want to go back to it and say, the joy of the Lord is our strength. We want to be able to say, God, help me to be able to deal with the things that are happening in this life so that I don't have to live with that anger and that torture of being held hostage by this bitterness. I want to live in the joy of the Lord. I want to live in the strength of the Lord. Help me to forgive, just as you've forgiven me. In Jesus' name. Please stand and pray with me.